The wind howled across the barren plains of the American frontier, carrying with it the dust of 1,000 broken dreams and the whispers of men who died trying to tame this unforgiving land. Here, in the heart of the wilderness, where the law was written in gunpowder and survival meant trusting no one, the town of Mercy's Bend squatted like a wounded animal against the horizon. Jack Carver stood at the edge of the Belmont Ranch, his weathered hands gripping the fence post as he watched the sun bleed crimson across the sky. At 32, he had the look of a man who'd lived 50 hard years, lines carved deep around eyes that had seen too much, shoulders broad from labor but bent from grief. His face, once handsome in the way that made young ladies in church pews whisper behind their fans, now wore the permanent mask of indifference that came from burying the better parts of oneself. It had been 5 years since Mary, 5 years since he'd held her bleeding body in the dusty street outside the Wells Fargo office, her Sunday dress turning dark with blood while the bandits' horses thundered away with the payroll money. 5 years since he'd made a promise to her fading eyes that he'd never break, never to let another soul that close again. The other ranch hands knew better than to ask about the photograph he kept wrapped in oilcloth in his saddlebag, or why he always volunteered for the loneliest posts, the farthest corners of the ranch where a man could go days without seeing another living soul. "Carver," old Pete hollered from the barn. "Boss wants to see you 'fore you head out to the north pasture." Jack nodded, not trusting his voice. Words had become precious things to him, doled out only when absolutely necessary. He'd learned that silence was armor, and he wore it like a second skin. Meanwhile, on the other side of Mercy's Bend, a different kind of arrival was causing its own stir. The stagecoach had deposited its passengers at noon, but it was the woman in the black traveling dress who drew the most attention. Evelyn Hart stepped down from the coach with the grace of someone who'd learned to move through the world without disturbing it, her gloved hand briefly accepting the driver's assistance before withdrawing into the folds of her skirts. She was beautiful in the way that made men remove their hats and women narrow their eyes. Dark hair swept up beneath a modest bonnet, skin pale as porcelain despite the prairie sun, and eyes the color of storm clouds over the mountains. But there was something else about her, something in the way she held herself that spoke of secrets carried like stones in her pockets. "That's the widow Hart," Martha Henley whispered to her companion outside the general store. "Came all the way from back east. They say husband died of fever, left her with that sickly brother of hers." The brother in question, Thomas, was indeed a sight to inspire pity. At 16, he had the pallor of consumption and moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose heart skipped beats like a broken music box. Evelyn kept one protective hand on his arm as they made their way down the dusty main street, her eyes fixed straight ahead, neither inviting nor acknowledging the curious stares that followed them like shadows. She'd rented the old Morrison place at the edge of town, a small clapboard house that had sat empty since the cholera took the Morrisons 2 winters back. Within days, she'd hung a simple sign in the window: E. Hart, seamstress, alterations and mending. The women of Mercy's Bend, starved for anything resembling Eastern fashion, soon overcame their suspicion enough to bring their worn Sunday dresses and their husbands' torn work clothes. Jack first heard about the new seamstress from Cookie, the ranch cook who collected gossip like some men collected scalps. "Pretty as a picture," Cookie said, stirring the evening's beans. "But there's something off about her. Myrtle Sanders says she saw scars on the woman's hands when she was fitting a dress. Not sewing scars, neither. Looked like defensive wounds. Man ought to mind his own business." Jack muttered, the first words he'd spoken all day. Cookie shrugged. "Just saying what I heard. Town like this, everybody's business becomes everybody's business eventually." Jack finished his meal in silence and retreated to his bedroll under the stars. He preferred sleeping outside, away from the snoring and storytelling of the bunkhouse. Out here, with nothing but the coyotes and the wind for company, a man could almost forget he'd ever known any life but this one. 3 weeks passed before fate, with its twisted sense of humor, brought Jack Carver to Evelyn Hart's door. He'd been moving cattle through Devil's Canyon when his horse spooked at a rattler. The resulting fall had left a gash in his palm deep enough to see white. He'd wrapped it in his bandana and continued working until old Pete threatened to dock his pay if he didn't get it seen to proper. "Ain't no doctor in town since Doc Pritchard went to California," Pete said. "But that new seamstress, she's got steady hands. Seen her work. She'll stitch you up good as new." Jack stood outside the small house, his good hand clenched at his side. Through the window, he could see her bent over her work, needle flashing in the lamplight. For a moment, just a moment, the sight of those delicate hands at their careful labor made something in his chest tighten like a fist. He knocked. When she opened the door, they stood there for a heartbeat that stretched like taffy, each taking the measure of the other. Up close, he could see that her beauty had edges to it, a tightness around her mouth, a wariness in those storm cloud eyes that matched his own. "Yes?" Her voice was cultured, Eastern, but with something else beneath it, like silk laid over steel. "Hand needs stitching." He unwrapped the bandana, showing the ugly wound. She studied it with the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen worse. "Come in, sit by the light." The house smelled of lavender and lye soap, with bolts of fabric stacked neat as soldiers along one wall. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound with carbolic that made him hiss through his teeth. Her hands were steady, sure, and softer than anything that had touched him in 5 years. "You'll need to keep it clean," she said, tying off the last stitch. "Change the bandage daily. Do you have clean cloth?" He nodded, watching as she wrapped his hand in fresh linen. When she was done, their eyes met again, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, of kindred damage. "How much?" he asked. 2 bits. He laid the coins on the table, careful not to let their fingers touch as she reached for them. At the door, he paused, some half-formed words rising in his throat like bubbles in still water. But the habit of silence was too strong. He touched the brim of his hat and stepped back into the dying light. Evelyn watched him go from her window, one hand pressed to her chest where her heart beat quick as a trapped bird. She'd come to Mercy's Bend to disappear, to build a life so ordinary that the past couldn't find her here. But those eyes, gray as winter sky, full of carefully banked pain, they'd seen straight through her careful facade to the woman underneath. That night, Jack lay under the stars with his bandaged hand throbbing in time with his pulse. He could still smell the lavender from her house, still feel the whisper of her fingers against his palm. For the first time in 5 years, he dreamed of something other than Mary's blood in the dust. He dreamed of storm cloud eyes and hands that knew how to stitch wounds, both seen and unseen. And miles away, in her narrow bed, Evelyn Hart lay wakeful, seeing again the face of the silent cowboy who'd looked at her not with the hunger she'd grown used to fearing, but with something far more dangerous, understanding. The wind continued its eternal passage across the plains, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath the vast Wyoming sky. But change, like the wind itself, had already begun to blow through Mercy's Bend, carrying with it the seeds of a story that would test whether 2 damaged souls could find redemption in each other's scarred hands. The Bellamont Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of hard Wyoming territory, and Jack Carver knew every gulch, every creek bed, every stand of cottonwood that offered shade to the longhorns. He'd been there 3 years now, longer than most cowboys stayed anywhere, and had earned a reputation as the best hand Sam Belmont had. Reliable, skilled with horses and cattle, and most importantly, a man who kept his mouth shut and his troubles to himself. The other hands had long since given up trying to draw him into their evening card games or weekend trips to the saloons. Jack worked, ate, and slept with the mechanical precision of a man who'd discovered that routine was the only thing standing between him and the abyss. When the others headed to town on Saturday nights, he'd ride out to the North Range and camp alone under the stars, reading by firelight from the same worn Bible Mary had given him the Christmas before she died. But lately, something had shifted in his carefully ordered world. His hand had healed clean, the stitches leaving only a thin white line across his palm, but he found himself unconsciously rubbing the scar when his mind wandered. And it wandered more than it should, always in the same direction, toward a small house on the edge of town, and the woman who lived there like a ghost made flesh, in Mercy's Bend. Evelyn Hart had become the subject of intense speculation. The women who patronized her shop marveled at her skill with needle and thread. How she could look at a length of calico and see the dress it would become. How her alterations made even the plainest garment fit like it had been crafted in the finest shops back east. But they also noticed things. How she never spoke of her late husband. How she declined all social invitations with polite but firm excuses. How her brother Thomas rarely ventured outside except to sit on the porch in the evening sun, his thin chest rising and falling with labored breath. "There's something she's not telling," Agnes Weatherby declared to the Ladies' Aid Society after Evelyn had politely refused yet another invitation to Sunday dinner. "A woman doesn't travel all this way alone, doesn't hide herself away like that, unless she's running from something." What the good ladies of Mercy's Bend didn't know was how close to the truth they were. Each night, Evelyn carefully locked her doors and windows, checking them twice, 3 times, before retiring. Each morning, she woke with her heart racing, certain she'd heard the sound of spurs on the porch, the heavy tread that had haunted her for years, but it was always just the wind, just her imagination conjuring phantoms from a past she'd traveled 2,000 miles to escape. It was a Friday evening in late September when their paths crossed again. Evelyn had closed the shop early, needing supplies from McBride's general store before it shuttered for the night. The sun was setting, painting Main Street in shades of amber and shadow, when she heard the unmistakable sounds of violence from the alley beside Murphy's saloon. "Where are you going, pretty lady?" The voice was slurred with whiskey, ugly with intent. "Just trying to be friendly-like." Evelyn's blood turned to ice water. Bill Hutchins, one of the town drunks, had cornered her between the rain barrels and the saloon side wall. His breath reeked of rot-gut whiskey, and his hands reached for her with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been told no in any way that mattered. "Please, Mr. Hutchins, let me pass." She kept her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs, even as memories of other hands, other corners, threatened to pull her under. Now that ain't neighborly. Hutchins lurched closer, his bulk blocking any escape. "Pretty woman like you, all alone, needs a man's protection." Evelyn's hand found the small knife in her pocket, the one she always carried, but before she could draw it, a shadow fell across the alley mouth. "The lady asked you to move." Jack's voice was quiet, conversational almost, but there was something in it that made Hutchins spin around, suddenly wary despite his drunken state. "This ain't your concern. Carver, just having a friendly chat with the widow." Jack stepped into the alley, his movements unhurried but purposeful. "Looks like the conversation's over. You'd best head on home. Bill, sleep it off." For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Hutchins outweighed Jack by 50 pounds, but there was something in the cowboy's stance, in the way his hand rested casual-like near his hip, that spoke of experience with situations gone bad. "Ain't worth the trouble anyway," Hutchins muttered, shoving past Jack and stumbling back toward the saloon. Evelyn sagged against the wall, her legs suddenly unsteady. Jack moved closer but kept a respectful distance, his gray eyes taking in her pallor, the way her hands shook as she smoothed her skirts. "You hurt?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Come on, I'll walk you home." They moved through the darkening streets in silence, Jack slightly ahead, his presence a barrier between her and any other threats the night might hold. At her door, she finally found her voice. "Thank you, Mr. Carver. Thank you." He touched his hat brim, made to leave, but her hand on his sleeve stopped him. "You're bleeding." In the lamplight spilling from her window, she could see the cut on his jaw where Hutchins must have landed a glancing blow, without waiting for permission. She drew him inside, pressing him into the same chair he'd occupied weeks before. Her hands were steadier now as she cleaned the cut, applied salve with careful fingers. This close, she could smell leather and horse and honest sweat, could see the fine lines around his eyes, the scar that bisected his left eyebrow. When she smoothed a strip of plaster over the cut, her fingers lingered a moment too long against his jaw, feeling the rasp of stubble, the warmth of living skin. Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, the careful walls they'd each built showed cracks. She saw past his coldness to the grief beneath. He saw past her composure to the fear she carried like a constant companion. "Who was he?" Jack asked quietly, and they both knew he wasn't talking about Hutchins. Evelyn's hand stilled. "My husband," the words came out cracked, brittle. He wasn't a kind man." Jack caught her wrist gently, turning it to the light. There, just visible beneath the edge of her sleeve, was the white line of an old scar. His thumb brushed over it, the touch barely there, but acknowledgement all the same. "He's dead now." "Yes." The word carried weight, finality, secrets she couldn't speak. Jack released her hand, stood to go. At the door, he turned back. "You need anything, any trouble like tonight, you send word to the Belmont Ranch. Someone will find me." After he left, Evelyn stood in her empty kitchen, one hand pressed to her throat where her pulse still raced. She moved to her bedroom, knelt beside the bed, and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in black cloth, was a wanted poster she'd torn down from a post office wall 3 states back. Her own face stared back at her, drawn by an artist who'd never seen her but had worked from her husband's description. Wanted for murder, Evelyn Whitehall, killed Robert Whitehall in cold blood, $500 reward. She burned the poster in the stove, watching her past turn to ash and smoke. But she knew, as she'd always known, that running from the truth was like trying to outride your own shadow. Eventually, it always caught up. That night, Jack lay in his bedroll, staring at the stars but seeing instead the delicate strength in Evelyn's hands, the shadows in her eyes that matched his own. For 5 years, he'd believed his heart was as dead as Mary, buried with her in the Mercy's Bend Cemetery. But something was stirring in that grave of his making, something that felt dangerously like hope. He thought of the way she'd touched his face, the way her fingers had trembled against his skin, and for the first time since Mary's death, he wanted with a fierce, unexpected hunger that scared him more than any gun-toting outlaw ever could, because wanting meant risking, and risking meant the possibility of losing everything all over again, miles away. Evelyn stood at her window, watching the moon rise over the endless prairie. Somewhere out there, a man who asked nothing of her but offered protection all the same was bedding down under the stars. A man whose gentle touch on her scarred wrist had somehow reached past all her defenses to the wounded heart beneath. She thought of her husband, of the nights of terror, the final, desperate moment when she'd grabbed the kitchen knife and changed everything. She thought of the months of running, of looking over her shoulder, of jumping at every unexpected sound, and she thought of gray eyes that had seen her scars, both visible and hidden, and hadn't turned away, for the first time since she'd fled Pennsylvania. Evelyn Hart allowed herself to consider that maybe, just maybe, she'd run far enough, that maybe, in this hard land where everyone had secrets and the past could be buried as deep as you were willing to dig, she might find not just hiding, but home. The blizzard came without warning, as they often did in the high country. One moment the sky was clear, the next, a wall of white descended from the mountains like the wrath of God himself. Jack had seen plenty of storms in his years on the range, but this one had teeth, the kind that could kill a man in hours if he wasn't careful. Evelyn had left town just after noon, driving the borrowed wagon toward Doc Hartley's place in the foothills. Thomas had taken a bad turn in the night, his breathing shallow and labored, and the old doctor had sent word he had a new medicine from Denver that might help. She'd wrapped herself in her heaviest cloak and taken the trail despite Martha Henley's warnings about the weather. "Storm's coming," the older woman had said, eyeing the northern sky. "Can smell it on the wind." But Thomas needed that medicine. and Evelyn had learned long ago that sometimes you had to risk the storm to save what mattered. The first flakes began falling when she was 5 miles out of town. Within minutes, the world transformed into a howling white void. The horse struggled against the wind, eyes rolling with fear as the trail disappeared beneath the mounting snow. Evelyn gripped the reins with numb fingers, squinting through the blinding white, trying to find any landmark that might guide her. The wagon wheel caught in a hidden rut, lurching violently. The horse screamed, thrashing in the traces, and suddenly everything was chaos, wood splintering, the world tilting. Evelyn thrown clear as the wagon overturned in a spray of snow and broken timber. She lay stunned, the breath knocked from her lungs, snow already beginning to cover her like a burial shroud. When she finally struggled to her feet, the horse was gone, broken free and vanished into the storm. The wagon lay on its side, one wheel still spinning lazily. And she was alone, 5 miles from anywhere, in a blizzard that was growing worse by the minute. Jack found her by pure chance, or maybe by providence, depending on what a man believed. He'd been bringing the horses in from the upper pasture when the storm hit, and was making for the line shack in Whiskey Grove when he spotted the overturned wagon. His heart lurched when he saw the small figure huddled beside it, already half covered in snow. "Evelyn!" He was off his horse and beside her in seconds, pulling her against him. She was conscious but barely, her lips blue with cold, her body shaking so hard she couldn't speak. No time for thinking. Jack stripped off his coat, wrapped it around her, then lifted her onto his horse. He swung up behind her, holding her tight against his chest, and turned the horse toward the line shack. It was closer than town, and in this storm, the difference might mean life or death. The shack was small but solid, built to withstand the worst mountain weather. Jack kicked the door open, carried Evelyn inside, and immediately set about building a fire in the pot-bellied stove. His hands, usually so steady, shook as he struck the matches. "Need to... Thomas..." Evelyn's teeth chattered so hard she could barely form words. "Medicine." "Later," Jack said firmly. "First, we get you warm." He found blankets in the storage chest, wrapped them around her, then pulled her close to the stove. She was soaked through, her dress heavy with snowmelt, and he knew what needed doing even as every proper instinct rebelled against it. "Your dress," he said quietly. "It's wet. You'll catch your death." Even through her hypothermic haze, Evelyn understood. With trembling fingers, she began working at the buttons, but her hands were too numb. Jack turned his back, heard the rustle of wet fabric, the soft thud as the dress hit the floor. I'm decent," she whispered. He turned to find her wrapped in blankets, only her face and bare shoulders visible. Her hair had come loose from its pins, falling around her like a dark curtain. In the firelight, she looked younger, vulnerable in a way that made his chest tight. He hung her dress near the stove to dry, then sat beside her on the narrow cot that served as the shack's only furniture. Outside, the storm raged like a living thing, wind screaming through the gaps in the walls. But inside, there was only the crackle of fire and the sound of their breathing slowly synchronizing. "Thank you," Evelyn said softly. "Again, stop thanking me." The words came out rougher than he intended. "Anyone would have..." "No." She shifted closer, whether for warmth or something else. He couldn't tell. "Not anyone. Not for someone like me." "What's that supposed to mean?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. She told him about Robert Whitehall, the charming man who'd courted her when she was just 17, who'd seemed like salvation from a life of genteel poverty, how the charm had lasted exactly until their wedding night, when he'd shown his true face. She spoke of years of fear, of bruises hidden beneath high collars and long sleeves, of a man who treated her like property to be used and discarded at will, of the night he'd come home drunk, raging about a business deal gone wrong, and decided she was to blame, of the moment when she'd realized he meant to kill her this time, really kill her, and how her hand had found the kitchen knife, I didn't mean to, she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. But he had his hands around my throat, and I couldn't breathe. And I wanted to live. Is that so wrong? To want to live? Jack pulled her against him, felt her tears soak through his shirt. No, he said fiercely. That's not wrong. That's the most right thing in the world. She cried then. Really cried. For the first time since that terrible night. Cried for the girl she'd been, for the years of fear, for the blood on her hands and the price on her head. Jack held her through it all, his arms a fortress against the storm, both outside and within. When the tears finally stopped, she pulled back slightly, looking up at him with eyes that held depths of pain and longing. I dream about it, she confessed. Every night, his face when the knife went in, the sound he made, the blood. Jack's hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing away the last of her tears. I dream too, he admitted, the words torn from some deep place he'd locked away. About Mary, about not being fast enough, not being there when she needed me, about the life we were supposed to have. They looked at each other then, really looked. Two souls stripped bare by loss and circumstance. The space between them seemed to hum with electricity, with possibility, with danger. Jack, Evelyn breathed, and then his mouth was on hers. Gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if they were both remembering how to do this thing that had once been as natural as breathing. The kiss deepened, became desperate, years of loneliness and grief pouring into this one point of connection. Evelyn's hands came up to tangle in his hair, and Jack pulled her closer, the blankets falling away as she pressed against him. But then, like a bucket of cold water, reality intruded. Jack pulled back, breathing hard, his hands shaking where they rested on her shoulders. I can't, he said hoarsely. I swore I can't lose someone again. I can't. Evelyn's face crumpled, but she nodded, understanding too well the fear that drove him. She pulled the blankets back around herself, moving to the far end of the cot. They sat in silence as the storm raged on. Two people who'd found and lost each other in the space of a heartbeat. The fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and still neither spoke. Finally, exhaustion won. Evelyn curled into herself, still shivering despite the warmth of the shack. Jack watched her for a long moment, then made his decision. He lay down beside her, pulled her back against his chest, and wrapped his arms around her. Just for warmth, he said roughly. Just for warmth. She agreed, but her hand found his where it rested against her stomach, fingers intertwining. They lay like that through the long night, while the blizzard spent its fury against the walls of their small shelter. Jack felt the rise and fall of her breathing, smelled the faint scent of lavender in her hair, and tried not to think about how right she felt in his arms, how the empty place inside him seemed less empty with her there. Evelyn, for her part, let herself imagine, just for these stolen hours, what it might be like to be held without fear, to trust the strength in the arms around her, to believe that maybe, sometimes, people could save each other. When dawn came, bringing with it the silence that meant the storm had passed, they rose and dressed without speaking. Jack saddled his horse while Evelyn gathered herself, trying to rebuild the walls that had crumbled in the night. The ride back to town was quiet. Evelyn seated in front of Jack on the horse, his arms necessarily around her to hold the reins. Each point of contact was exquisite torture, a reminder of what they'd almost allowed themselves to have. At the edge of town, Jack reined in. The doc'll have heard about the storm. He'll understand about the medicine. Evelyn nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Evelyn, her name on his lips was like a prayer and a curse combined. What happened last night was a mistake. She finished for him, though the words tasted like ash. I know, you made yourself clear. She slid down from the horse before he could help her, walked away without looking back. But she left something behind all the same, the memory of her warmth, the taste of her tears, the ghost of what might have been. Jack watched her go, His hands clenched on the reins so tight his knuckles went white. He'd saved her from the storm, but who would save him from the tempest she'd awakened in his carefully frozen heart? As Evelyn reached her door, she allowed herself one glance back. Jack still sat there, a dark silhouette against the morning sky, as alone as the day she'd first seen him. She pressed a hand to her chest, where her heart beat wild and painful, then stepped inside and shut the door on what could never be. But she kept the handkerchief he'd given her to dry her tears, pressed it between the pages of her Bible like a pressed flower, a remembrance of one night when the storm outside had been nothing compared to the storm within, and two broken people had almost found their way to whole. Jack threw himself into work with the single-minded determination of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. He took every dangerous job, every distant ride, anything that would keep him away from town and the magnetic pull of a small house on its outskirts. The other ranch hands noticed the change. Jack had always been quiet, but now he was like a ghost, there but not there, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. "Something eating at you, Carver?" Sam Belmont asked one evening, finding Jack mending tack long after the other men had turned in. The ranch owner was a fair man who knew when to push and when to let be, but Jack had been with him long enough to earn the question. "Nothing that concerns the work," Jack replied, not looking up from the bridle in his hands. Sam studied him for a long moment. "You know, I lost my first wife to childbed fever. Thought I'd never look at another woman again. Then Sarah came along, and..." He shrugged. "Sometimes life gives you a second chance. Shame to waste it because you're too scared to reach for it." After Sam left, Jack sat in the barn's darkness, the leather work forgotten in his lap. He thought about chances, about fear, about the way Evelyn had felt in his arms during that long, storm-bound night. Then he packed those thoughts away like he always did, locked them down deep where they couldn't hurt him. But life, as Jack was learning, had a way of forcing a man's hand. In town, Evelyn's situation was growing precarious. The landlord, Cyrus Granger, had arrived at her door with bad news and worse intentions. "Rent's going up," he announced, his piggish eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. $30 a month, starting next week. But Mr. Granger, that's double what we agreed. Take it or leave it." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Of course, might be we could work out an arrangement. Pretty woman like you, all alone, must get lonely." Evelyn's hand found the knife in her pocket, but she kept her voice level. "I'll have the money. Good day, Mr. Granger." After he left, she sank into a chair, calculating desperately. Even with the steady stream of sewing work, $30 was impossible. She'd have to dip into her hidden savings, the money she'd kept for emergencies, for running if the past caught up. The next morning, she found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was $10 and a note in careful script, "For the medicine you couldn't get." No signature, but she knew that handwriting. She'd seen it on the receipt he'd signed for her services. Pride warred with desperation. She needed the money, but taking it felt like accepting more than just cash. It felt like admitting that the connection between them, the thing they were both trying so hard to deny, was real enough to act on. She kept the money, and hated herself for the warm feeling it gave her, knowing he was still watching out for her even from a distance. The rumors started small, as rumors do. Someone had seen the widow heading out of town the day of the storm. Someone else had spotted Jack Carver bringing her back the next morning, her hair loose and wild, riding his horse like a common woman. By the time the story made its rounds through the Ladies' Aid Society, it had grown into something altogether more scandalous. "Always knew there was something off about her," Agnes Weatherby declared. "No respectable widow carries on like that." But worse than the gossip was the letter that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a stranger who rode into town on a lathered horse, asked for directions to the widow Hart's place, and rode out just as quick. Evelyn's hands trembled as she opened it, though she'd been expecting something like this for months. Mrs. Whitehall, it read. Your husband's associates have not forgotten the debt you owe. We know where you are, unless you want the whole town to know what you did. You'll leave $500 at the old mill outside town by week's end. This is just the beginning. No signature, but she recognized the hand. Marcus Townsend, Robert's business partner, the man who'd helped him hide his cruelties behind a veneer of respectability, the man who'd known what Robert was and hadn't cared, so long as the money kept flowing. That night, Evelyn sat at Thomas's bedside, watching his labored breathing, and faced the truth she'd been running from. She couldn't run anymore. Thomas was too sick to travel, and even if he wasn't, she was tired of looking over her shoulder, tired of jumping at shadows, tired of being afraid. She needed help, and though it galled her to admit it, she knew exactly who to turn to. The next day brought news that changed everything. A federal marshal had ridden into Mercy's Bend, asking questions about a woman named Evelyn Whitehall. Marshal Daniel Crawford was a hard man with eyes like chips of flint and a reputation for always getting his quarry. I have reason to believe she's going by the name Hart now, he told Sheriff Watson, his voice carrying the authority of the badge on his chest. She's wanted for the murder of her husband in Pennsylvania. There's a substantial reward for information leading to her capture. The sheriff, who'd always thought there was something sad about the pretty widow, found himself reluctant to help. Can't say I've heard that name. We got a seamstress named Hart, but she's been nothing but respectable since she arrived. Crawford smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant thing. In my experience, Sheriff, the ones who seem most respectable often have the most to hide. Word spread like wildfire. Within hours, everyone in Mercy's Bend knew about the marshal and his questions. At the general store, conversation stopped when Evelyn entered. At the bank, the teller's hands shook as he counted out her meager withdrawal. Even the children seemed to sense the change, scurrying out of her path like she carried some contagion. It was Martha Henley who broke ranks first, arriving at Evelyn's door as the sun set. "That marshal's been asking about you," she said without preamble, "offering money for information." Evelyn's face went white, but she kept her composure. "I see." Martha studied her for a long moment. "I had a sister once, married a man who used his fists when the drink was on him. One night she hit him back with a fireplace poker. He lived, but barely." She paused. Sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. After Martha left, Evelyn made her preparations. She packed what little they could carry, made Thomas as comfortable as possible for travel, and tried not to think about what she was leaving behind. As she folded her few dresses, her fingers found the handkerchief Jack had given her, and she had to stop, pressing it to her face as tears threatened to fall. A knock at the door made her freeze. Had Crawford come already? But when she peered through the curtain, it was Jack standing on her porch, hat in hand. She opened the door, and they stood there looking at each other, everything that needed saying hanging in the air between them. "You heard," she said finally. "Everyone's heard." His jaw was tight, his gray eyes stormy. "Is it true?" "Which part?" Her laugh was bitter. "That I killed my husband?" "Yes." "That it was murder?" She met his eyes squarely. "That depends on whether you think a woman has the right to defend herself against a man who's trying to kill her." Jack was silent for a long moment. Then he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Pack what you need. I'm taking you and Thomas to the ranch. Crawford won't look for you there." "Jack, I can't." "You can and you will." His voice was firm, allowing no argument. "That marshal, he's not interested in justice. I heard him talking at the saloon. Your husband's family is paying him under the table to bring you back dead or alive. And he doesn't much care which." Evelyn sank into a chair, the fight going out of her. "I'm so tired of running." "Then stop." Jack knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his rough ones. "Stay and fight. You've got friends here, people who know who you are now, not who you were then." "And you?" she asked quietly. "What am I to you?" "Jack?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, carefully, as if the words were being pulled from him, "You're the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I see before I sleep. You're the woman who made me remember what it feels like to want to live instead of just exist. You're everything I swore I'd never let myself have again. But you still won't. I'm here, aren't I? He squeezed her hands gently. Maybe I'm a fool. Maybe I'm setting myself up for another loss I won't survive. But I'd rather be a fool than a coward, and letting you face this alone would be the worst kind of cowardice. Evelyn felt something crack open inside her chest, a wall she'd built brick by brick since the night she'd fled Pennsylvania. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a soft, desperate kiss that tasted of tears and promises. When they parted, Jack's eyes were bright with something that might have been hope. Get your things. We're leaving now, before Crawford decides to pay you a visit. As they prepared Thomas for travel, wrapping him in blankets against the night air, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found something worth fighting for. Not just survival, but a life. Not just safety, but home. The ride to the Bellamont Ranch was tense, every shadow potentially hiding Crawford or worse, Townsend's men, but they made it without incident. And soon Evelyn and Thomas were installed in the foreman's cabin, with Jack standing guard like a protective wolf. Tomorrow, we'll get you a lawyer, he said. There's a good one in Cheyenne. We'll fight this proper-like. Evelyn nodded, exhaustion finally catching up with her. As Jack turned to leave, she caught his sleeve. Stay, she whispered. Please, I don't want to be alone tonight. He hesitated, then nodded. He sat in the chair by the door, rifle across his knees, keeping watch, and if sometime in the deep of night, Evelyn woke to find him holding her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. Neither of them spoke of it, because tomorrow would bring its own battles. But tonight, in this small circle of safety, two wounded souls could pretend that love might be stronger than fear, that redemption was possible, and that some things were worth standing and fighting for, no matter the cost. The lawyer from Cheyenne arrived 3 days later, a thin, serious man named William Thornton, who wore spectacles and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd won more fights in courtrooms than most men had won in saloons. Jack had sent for him at Sam Bellamont's recommendation, and paid his retainer from his own savings without telling Evelyn. Mrs. Hart, Thornton said after hearing her story, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. What you're describing is clear self-defense. The problem is proving it. Your husband's family has influence, money, and most importantly, they've controlled the narrative. In their version, you're a calculating woman who killed for inheritance. There was no inheritance, Evelyn said bitterly. Only debts and bruises. Can anyone testify to the abuse? Servants? Neighbors? She shook her head. Robert was careful. He knew how to hurt without leaving marks others could see, and when he did leave marks, she touched her shoulder unconsciously, where the worst scars lay hidden. I became very good at hiding them. Thornton made notes in his leather-bound book. We'll need to establish pattern of behavior. Any police reports? Doctor visits? You don't understand, Evelyn said quietly. Robert's brother is a judge. His uncle owns half the police force in Philadelphia. Going to them would have been signing my own death warrant. Jack, who'd been standing silent by the window, spoke up. What about Crawford, the marshal? Thornton's expression darkened. Daniel Crawford is a problem. He's operating on a federal warrant, but from what I've learned, he's also taking money from the Whitehall family. He wants to bring Mrs. Hart back alive if possible. There's more money in it. But he's authorized to use whatever force necessary. Over my dead body, Jack said flatly. The lawyer studied him over his spectacles. That, Mr. Carver, is exactly what I'm trying to prevent. They spent the morning going over options, each seeming worse than the last. Evelyn could turn herself in and hope for a fair trial, though Thornton was clear about her chances in a Pennsylvania court owned by the Whitehalls. She could keep running, though with Thomas so ill, that seemed impossible. Or she could stay and fight, knowing that Crawford would eventually track her to the ranch. It was Thomas who made the decision for her. That afternoon, His breathing took a turn for the worse, and they had to send for Doc Hartley. The old physician's face was grave as he examined the boy. "His heart's failing faster than I hoped," he told Evelyn gently. "Moving him now would likely kill him. He needs rest, stability, and—" He paused. "You should prepare yourself, my dear. We're talking weeks, maybe a month or two at most." Evelyn sat by her brother's bedside, holding his thin hand, and felt the last of her strength crumble. Thomas was all the family she had left, the one pure thing in her life that Robert hadn't been able to corrupt or destroy. Losing him would be like losing the last piece of her soul that remembered how to hope. Jack found her there hours later, still as a statue. Tears dried on her cheeks. Without a word, he sat beside her, his solid presence an anchor in the storm of her grief. "I can't lose him," she whispered. "He's just a boy. He never hurt anyone." "You won't lose him," Jack said firmly. "Not to the law, not to Crawford, not to anyone. I swear it." She looked at him then, saw the determination in his gray eyes, and something else, something that looked like the love he'd been too afraid to name. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this? You could walk away. No one would blame you." Jack was quiet for a long moment, watching Thomas's labored breathing. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "When Mary died, I thought my life was over, and in a way, it was. The man I'd been, the one who believed in forever and happy endings, he died with her. I became something else, a ghost, a man going through the motions because I didn't know how to stop." He turned to face her fully. "Then you came along? You and your damaged hands and your secrets and your stubborn refusal to be broken by what the world had done to you. You made me remember what it felt like to be alive, to want things, to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth fighting for. Jack!" "I'm not done." He took her hands in his. "I'm scared, terrified. If you want the truth, because I know what it costs to love someone and lose them, but I'm more scared of living the rest of my life wondering what if I'd been brave enough? What if I'd chosen love over fear? What if I'd let you face this alone and something happened to you?" Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Are you saying, I'm saying I love you, Evelyn Hart or Whitehall, or whoever you need to be? I love your courage and your scars and the way you hum when you think no one's listening. I love how gentle you are with Thomas and how fierce you are when cornered. I love you, and I'll stand with you against Crawford and the Whitehalls and the devil himself if need be." She kissed him then, pouring all her fear and hope and desperate love into the connection. When they parted, both were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together. "I love you too," she whispered. "But I'm trouble. Jack, nothing but trouble." "Good thing I'm not looking for easy," he replied, managing a small smile. Their moment was interrupted by voices from outside. Jack moved to the window, his hand automatically going to his gun. "Crawford," he said grimly, "and he's not alone." Marshal Crawford had arrived with 2 deputies, hard-faced men who looked like they'd enjoy their work a little too much. They stopped at the main house first, and Jack could see Sam Bellamont on the porch, arms crossed, clearly not inclined to cooperate. "We need to move," Jack said. "Get Thomas ready. There's a place." But Evelyn stood, squaring her shoulders. "No, no more running. If we do this, we do it right. We face it head on." "Evelyn, Mr. Thornton said I needed witnesses to Robert's character. Well, I have something better." She moved to her trunk, pulled out a small leather journal. "I kept records. Every beating, every threat, every time he hurt me, dates, times, injuries. I thought maybe someday I could use it to get away legally. I never imagined it would come to this." Jack took the journal, flipping through pages of neat handwriting that documented years of horror in clinical detail. His jaw tightened with each entry. "This could work," he said slowly. "But Crawford won't care. He's being paid to bring you back, not to see justice done. Then we make him care." Evelyn said, or we make it so he has no choice. They didn't have long to plan. Within an hour, Crawford was at the foreman's cabin door, his deputies flanking him. Jack opened it, keeping his body between them and the interior. "Marshal," he said evenly. "Help you with something." "Step aside. Carver, I know she's in there." Crawford's voice was cold, professional. "Evelyn Whitehall, you're under arrest for the murder of Robert Whitehall. Come out with your hands where I can see them." "She's not going anywhere," Jack said flatly. Crawford's hand moved to his gun. "I've got paper that says different. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Actually, Marshal," Thornton's voice came from behind Jack as the lawyer stepped into view, "I think you'll find the situation is more complex than your warrant suggests." "Thornton," Crawford's eyes narrowed. "Should have known you'd turn up. This is a federal matter. Your client is wanted for murder." "My client," Thornton said smoothly, "is prepared to surrender herself, but only after a proper hearing before Judge Mackenzie in Cheyenne, a neutral venue, as I'm sure you'll agree, given the Whitehall family's influence in Pennsylvania. That's not how this works. It is when we have evidence of judicial corruption and witness tampering." Thornton held up a telegram. "Interesting thing about telegraph operators, they remember unusual messages, like ones offering to pay a federal marshal extra for a quick, quiet retrieval." Crawford's face darkened. "You threatening me, counselor?" "Not at all. I'm simply suggesting that a man of your reputation would want this done properly, legally, unless you'd prefer questions about your supplementary income." The two men stared at each other. A silent battle of wills. Finally, Crawford spoke. "The woman comes with me." "She can have her hearing, but she'll wait for it in custody." "No." Jack stepped forward. "She stays here until the hearing. You can post guards if you want, but she doesn't leave this ranch." "And why would I agree to that?" It was Evelyn who answered, stepping around Jack despite his attempt to keep her back. "Because I'm not the only one with something to lose. Marshal Crawford." She held up another paper, a letter bearing the Whitehall seal. "This offers you $5,000 to ensure I never make it to trial. Accidents happen on long journeys. After all." Crawford's face went pale. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. "Where did you—" Robert was many things, but careful wasn't always one of them. Evelyn's voice was steady, though Jack could see her hands trembling. "I have more letters, documents, proof of bribes and corruption going back years. If something happens to me, Mr. Thornton has instructions to send copies to every newspaper from here to Washington." "You're bluffing. Try me." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Crawford holstered his gun with a curse. "3 days," he growled. "You've got 3 days to get to Cheyenne for your hearing. My men will be watching every road. You run, and I'll hunt you down like the criminal you are." After they left, Evelyn sagged against Jack, all her brave strength suddenly gone. "3 days," she whispered. "It's not enough time." "It'll have to be," Jack said, holding her close. "We'll make it be." That night, as they prepared for what might be their last stand, Jack sat with Evelyn in the cabin's main room. Thomas slept fitfully in the next room, his breathing a constant reminder of all they stood to lose. "Whatever happens," Evelyn said quietly, "I want you to know that these past months, despite everything, have been the happiest of my life. You gave me something I never thought I'd have again. Hope." Jack pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "This isn't goodbye," he said firmly. "We're going to win this. You're going to be free, and then—" He paused, reaching into his pocket. "Then I'm going to do this proper." He pulled out a small, worn ring, simple gold with a tiny chip of turquoise. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "Been carrying it for years. Never thought I'd have use for it again, but I want you to have it. Not now. I know you can't wear it now. But after, when you're free and clear, if you'll have me." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she took the ring, holding it like the precious thing it was. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times, yes. They held each other through the night, two souls preparing for battle, knowing that morning would bring either freedom or destruction. But for now, in this moment, they had each other. And sometimes, that was enough to make even the darkest night bearable. The hearing in Cheyenne was set, but Evelyn's world in Mercy's Bend had already begun to crumble. Word of her true identity spread like wildfire through the town, and with it came the inevitable judgment. The same women who had praised her needlework now crossed the street to avoid her. The general store suddenly had no more credit to extend. Even the church, where she'd sought solace in quiet moments, felt cold and unwelcoming. "Murderess," someone hissed as she passed on the street, gathering supplies for what might be their last days at the ranch. "Jezebel," came another voice, "bringing her sin to our town." Evelyn kept her head high, though each word cut deep. She'd known this would happen. Respectability was a fragile thing, easily shattered by truth. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. It was at Miller's restaurant where things came to a head. She'd gone in to buy bread, a simple transaction that should have taken minutes. But Carl Miller, whose wife's wedding dress she'd altered just months ago, stood behind the counter with his arms crossed. "We don't serve your kind here," he said flatly. "My kind?" Evelyn's voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "You mean women who defend themselves? Or just women who refuse to die quietly?" "I mean killers," Miller spat. "You can dress it up however you like, but you took a man's life. No decent establishment will have you." The few patrons in the restaurant stared, some with sympathy, but none with the courage to speak up. Evelyn stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of their judgment, then turned to leave. She found Jack waiting outside, his face dark with anger. "I heard," he said simply. "It doesn't matter," she said, though they both knew it did. "I have bigger concerns than the opinion of small-minded people." But that evening, when rocks crashed through the cabin windows and voices shouted obscenities from the darkness, it mattered very much indeed. Jack grabbed his rifle, ready to confront the attackers, but Evelyn stopped him. "No," she said quietly. "That's what they want. An excuse to say we're violent, dangerous. We can't give them that." They spent the night in vigilance, Jack boarding up the broken windows while Evelyn comforted a terrified Thomas. By morning, exhaustion weighed on them like lead, but there was no time for rest. The hearing was tomorrow, and they still had preparations to make. It was then that Jack made his decision. "I'm moving in," he announced, carrying his bedroll and few possessions from the bunkhouse. "Anybody wants to throw rocks, they'll have to go through me." "Jack, your reputation—" "To hell with my reputation." His gray eyes were fierce. "You think I care what these people think? The same people who'd let a woman die rather than defend herself. No, we're in this together." That declaration, more than anything else, sealed their fate in the eyes of the town. Living together without marriage was scandal enough, but a killer and the man who protected her, it was more than Mercy's Bend's fragile morality could bear. But in the cabin, surrounded by hostility, something beautiful bloomed. Without the pretense of propriety, without the careful distance they'd maintained, Jack and Evelyn found a rhythm of domesticity that felt like coming home. She mended his clothes and cooked their simple meals. He fixed the loose floorboards and read to Thomas when the boy was too weak to hold a book. They moved around each other with the easy familiarity of long married couples, finding comfort in small touches and shared glances. The night before the hearing, as they lay together in the narrow bed they'd pushed against the wall farthest from the windows, Evelyn traced the scars on Jack's chest, old wounds from his years on the range. "Tell me about her," she said quietly. "Mary," Jack tensed, but her gentle touch soothed him. "She was sunshine," he said finally. "Always laughing, always seeing the best in people. She would have liked you, even knowing what I did, especially knowing what you did." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "She was fierce about protecting people. Used to take in every stray animal and wounded soul she could find. She would have understood about surviving. They made love then, slow and tender, a claiming and a promise all at once. In the darkness, skin to skin, they were just two people who'd found each other against all odds. The world outside, with its judgment and violence, couldn't touch them here. Afterwards, Evelyn lay with her head on Jack's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. "Of the hearing? Of any of it. Living, dying, fighting. None of it scares me now." She looked up at him. "You gave me that. You gave me back my courage." Jack's arms tightened around her. "You always had courage. You just needed someone to remind you." Morning came too soon, bringing with it the reality of what they faced. As they prepared for the journey to Cheyenne, Thomas took a turn for the worse. His breathing became labored, his skin gray with the effort of pulling air into failing lungs. "I can't leave him," Evelyn said, panic rising in her voice. "Not like this." "You have to," Doc Hartley said gently. He'd come to check on the boy, braving the town's disapproval. Missing that hearing means arrest, jail, being dragged back to Pennsylvania in chains. Thomas wouldn't want that. "I'll stay with him," Martha Henley announced from the doorway. She'd arrived with a basket of food and a defiant glare for anyone who might question her. "That boy needs tending, and I've raised 6 of my own. Go, fight, come back free." The goodbye was almost too painful to bear. Evelyn kissed Thomas's forehead, whispered promises to return, tried not to see how his eyes had already begun to look past her to somewhere else. "Take care of her," Thomas whispered to Jack, his voice barely a breath. "She pretends to be strong, but—" "I know," Jack said quietly. "I'll keep her safe. You have my word." The ride to Cheyenne was tense, Crawford's deputies trailing them like wolves. But they made it without incident, arriving at the courthouse to find a crowd already gathered. News of the hearing had spread. A woman who'd killed her husband, a federal marshal accused of taking bribes, corruption stretching from Wyoming to Pennsylvania. It was the kind of story that sold newspapers and filled courtroom galleries. That night, in their hotel room, Evelyn stood at the window watching the gas lamps flicker in the street below. "What if they send me back?" she asked. "What if the truth doesn't matter?" Jack came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Then we run," he said simply. "Mexico, Canada, somewhere they can't reach. We take Thomas and disappear." "You do that? Give up everything?" "Everything." He turned her to face him. "You are everything. The ranch, the job, this whole life. It's nothing without you in it." She kissed him then, fierce and desperate, and they came together with an urgency born of fear and love, and the knowledge that tomorrow could change everything. Every touch was a promise, every whispered word a vow. They loved with the intensity of those who know that love itself is an act of defiance against a world that would tear them apart. Later, as they lay entwined, Evelyn traced the new scar on Jack's jaw, the one he'd gotten defending her that night in the alley. "I've ruined your life," she said softly. "No," he said firmly. "You saved it. I was dead before you came. Walking, working, breathing, but dead all the same. You brought me back to life. Evelyn, whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that. You gave me back my heart." They held each other through the remaining hours of darkness, not sleeping, not speaking, just existing in the space between heartbeats where time couldn't touch them. Outside, Cheyenne went about its business, unaware that in one small hotel room, 2 people were writing their own definition of forever. When dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they rose and dressed in their best clothes. Evelyn wore the blue dress she'd made for herself in those early days in Mercy's Bend, when she'd still believed she could hide from the past. Jack wore his one good suit, the one he'd bought for funerals and hadn't worn since Mary's. "Ready?" he asked, offering her his arm. She took it, chin high, eyes clear. "Ready." They walked out into the morning light together, prepared to face whatever came. The hearing awaited, and with it, judgment. but they would face it as they'd learned to face everything, together, unashamed and unafraid. Behind them, in Mercy's Bend, Thomas breathed his last breath with Martha holding his hand, a smile on his face as if he'd seen something beautiful waiting for him. The news wouldn't reach them until after the hearing. One more grief in a story already heavy with loss. But perhaps he knew, in those final moments, that his sister had found what he'd always wanted for her. Someone who would love her scars and all. Someone who would stand with her against the world. The courthouse loomed before them, imposing and cold. But Evelyn's hand was warm in Jack's, and that was enough. Whatever came next, they would weather it. They had already survived the worst. The loneliness, the fear, the terrible cost of staying alive in a world that would rather see you broken. Now all that remained was to prove that, sometimes, the law and justice could be the same thing. That sometimes, love was stronger than the past. That sometimes, two damaged people could build something whole and beautiful from the pieces of their broken lives. The doors opened, they walked through together, and the rest of their story began. The courtroom had barely settled when the doors burst open with a crash. A man in an expensive suit strode in, his face twisted with hatred, followed by two rough-looking men whose hands hovered near their guns. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. She knew that face, had seen it in her nightmares. Marcus Townsend, Robert's former business partner, the man who'd helped hide her husband's cruelties behind a veneer of respectability. "There she is," Townsend snarled, pointing at Evelyn. "The woman who murdered my friend and partner." Judge Mackenzie banged his gavel. "Sir, you cannot—" But Townsend's men were already moving. One grabbed Evelyn's arm, yanking her from her seat. Jack reacted instantly, his fist connecting with the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. The second man pulled his gun, and suddenly the courtroom erupted in chaos. "Nobody move!" Crawford shouted, his own weapon drawn. But in the confusion, it wasn't clear who he was aiming at. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Jack stumbled, his hand going to his shoulder where red bloomed across his white shirt. Evelyn screamed, catching him as he fell, pressing her hands against the wound. "Jack! No, no, no!" "Get her out of here!" Jack gritted through clenched teeth, his face pale but his eyes fierce. "Townsend's not here for justice." Another shot rang out. This time it was Townsend who fired, aiming for Evelyn. Jack, despite his wound, threw himself over her, shielding her with his body. The bullet caught him in the side, and this time when he fell, he didn't get back up. "Jack!" Evelyn cradled his head in her lap, tears streaming down her face, blood soaked through her blue dress, spreading like spilled ink. "Please, please don't leave me. Run!" he whispered, his gray eyes already starting to dim. "Live. For both of us." But Evelyn was done running. As Townsend advanced, his gun raised for the killing shot, something cold and final settled in her chest. She grabbed the Derringer from Jack's boot, the small gun he always carried as backup, and faced the man who'd helped make her life a living hell. "You took everything from me once," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Not again." Townsend laughed, an ugly sound. "You think you can outdraw me, woman? You're nothing but a—" Evelyn fired, once, twice. Both bullets found their mark, and Townsend crumpled, his gun falling from lifeless fingers. His men, seeing their employer fall, fled rather than face Crawford's deputies. The courtroom was silent except for Jack's labored breathing. Evelyn dropped the gun, gathering Jack closer, pressing her lips to his forehead. "Don't you dare die on me," she whispered fiercely. You promised we'd have forever." "Evelyn." His hand found hers, weak but determined. "Worth it. You're worth everything." "Get a doctor," someone shouted. "Judge Mackenzie himself," she realized dimly. Now. The next hours passed in a blur. The doctor, a young man with steady hands and kind eyes, worked on Jack while Evelyn waited, still in her blood-stained dress, refusing to move from the hallway outside the surgery. Martha Henley appeared at some point, her face grave, and Evelyn knew before she spoke. "Thomas?" she asked. Martha nodded, tears in her eyes. "Peaceful. At the end, he smiled, said to tell you he was proud of you." Evelyn felt something break inside her chest, a grief so profound it stole her breath. Her baby brother, gone, Jack fighting for his life. Everything she touched, everyone she loved. The violence followed. "This is my fault," she whispered. "All of it." "No." Martha's voice was firm. "The only fault lies with the men who thought they owned you, who thought your life was worth less than their pride." She gripped Evelyn's shoulders. "That man in there, he loves you enough to die for you. Don't dishonor that by blaming yourself." When the doctor finally emerged, dawn was breaking. "He'll live," he said, and Evelyn's knees nearly buckled with relief. The shoulder wound was clean. Missed anything vital? The side? That was closer. He lost a lot of blood, but he's strong, and more importantly, he's fighting. Keeps asking for you. Evelyn flew to Jack's bedside. He was pale as the sheets, his breathing shallow, but his eyes opened when she took his hand. "Hey," he whispered. "Hey yourself." She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "You scared me." "Sorry, didn't mean to be dramatic." Despite everything, she laughed, a watery sound, but genuine. "Jack Carver, you got shot twice protecting me. I think you're allowed some drama." "Evelyn." His grip tightened on her hand. "Townsend? Dead. He won't hurt anyone ever again." Jack studied her face, seeing the weight of another death on her conscience. "You did what you had to do, to protect us both. I'm so tired of killing," she whispered. "So tired of death following me everywhere." "Then let's choose life," Jack said. "Marry me, right now, here, before anything else can happen." "Jack, you're hurt. I've never been more sure of anything." His gray eyes burned with intensity. "I don't want to waste another minute. We've lost so much time to fear already." Judge Mackenzie, when approached, was surprisingly amenable. Perhaps it was guilt over the violence in his courtroom, or perhaps he'd seen enough to understand that justice and law didn't always align. Either way, he arrived at Jack's bedside that afternoon with a Bible and the necessary papers. It was the strangest wedding Mercy's Bend, or Cheyenne, had ever seen. The groom lay propped against pillows, still pale from blood loss. The bride wore a borrowed dress, her own being beyond salvation. The witnesses were a federal marshal who'd started as their enemy, and Martha Henley, who'd defied a whole town to stand with them. But when Jack spoke his vows, his voice was strong. "Evelyn, you came into my life when I'd given up on living. You showed me that surviving wasn't enough, that even scarred hearts could learn to love again. I promise to stand with you, fight for you, and love you through whatever comes. Forever." Evelyn's voice trembled with emotion. "Jack, you saw me when I was trying so hard to be invisible. You gave me strength when I had none left. You showed me that the past doesn't have to define us, that we can choose who we become. I promise to love you, to trust you, and to build a life with you where the shadows can't reach. Forever." When Judge Mackenzie pronounced them husband and wife, and Jack pulled Evelyn down for a kiss that was tender and fierce all at once, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. "About your case," the judge said, clearing his throat. "Given the evidence presented, Townsend's attack, and the clear pattern of abuse documented in your journal, I'm dismissing all charges. You're free, Mrs. Carver. Truly free." Evelyn wept then, the tears of someone who'd carried a burden so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Jack held her as best he could with his injuries, whispering words of comfort and love. 2 weeks later, when Jack was strong enough to travel, they made the journey back to Mercy's Bend. The town that had turned against them seemed smaller somehow, less significant. They stopped at the cemetery first, where Thomas had been laid to rest. Evelyn knelt by the fresh grave, pressing her hand to the earth. "I'm free, Tommy," she whispered, "just like you wanted. And I'm loved. Jack kept his promise to take care of me." They didn't stay in Mercy's Bend. Too much had happened, too much judgment and cruelty. Sam Bellamont, hearing their story, offered them work on a new spread he was starting up north, a fresh start where no one knew their past. As their wagon rolled out of town, loaded with their few possessions and infinite possibilities, Evelyn looked back once. The small house where she'd tried so hard to disappear stood empty, its windows dark, but she felt no regret, only gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Regrets?" Jack asked, following her gaze. "No," she said, turning to face forward, her hand finding his. "Just remembering who I was when I arrived. Scared, alone, certain I'd never be anything but a woman on the run. And now," she smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Now I'm Evelyn Carver, wife, survivor, and ready for whatever comes next." Jack lifted their joined hands to his lips. "That's my girl." The wagon rolled on, carrying them toward their new life. Behind them, the past grew smaller with each mile. Ahead, the mountains rose against the sky, promising new challenges and new joys. They would face them together, these two souls who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk into the light. The scars remained, on their bodies, in their hearts. Jack would always carry the bullets meant for Evelyn. She would always bear the marks of violence survived, but scars, they'd learned, were just proof of battles won, of a life fought for and claimed. And as the sun set on their first day of true freedom, painting the sky in shades of hope and promise, Evelyn Hart Carver allowed herself to believe in the one thing she'd thought lost forever, a future. Not just survival, but life. Not just safety, but love. Not just an ending, but a beginning. The past was done. The future beckoned. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, they were ready to meet it with open hearts and joined hands, knowing that whatever storms might come, they would weather them together. 1 year later, the mountains of northern Wyoming stood witness to a transformation. Where once there had been only wilderness, now a modest ranch spread across a valley sheltered by pine-covered slopes. The Double C Ranch, named for Carver and the new beginning it represented, wasn't much to look at yet, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and honest sweat. Evelyn stood on the porch of their cabin, watching Jack work with the horses in the corral. His movements were easy, confident, though she could still see the slight hitch in his shoulder where Townsend's bullet had left its mark. The morning sun caught the silver threading through his dark hair, premature gray from their trials, but she found it distinguished. "Mail's here," called out Ben Patterson, their sole ranch hand, riding up from town with a full saddlebag. He was young, earnest, and completely uninterested in their past, exactly what they needed. Evelyn took the bundle, sorting through the usual supplies orders and correspondence from Sam Belmont. Then her hand stilled on an official-looking envelope from Philadelphia. Her heart skipped, old fears rising, but she forced herself to open it. Inside was a letter from William Thornton, their lawyer, and a bank draft that made her gasp. "The estate of Robert Whitehall has been settled," Thornton wrote. "After investigation into his criminal enterprises, authorities discovered substantial illegal gains. As his widow and victim, the court has awarded you compensation. Additionally, testimony from your journal helped convict 12 members of his trafficking ring." Evelyn sank onto the porch step, overwhelmed. After all the running, all the fear, justice had found its way to her door in the most unexpected form. "What is it?" Jack asked, coming up from the corral, concern creasing his features. Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. He read it, whistled low, then sat beside her. "That's enough to expand the ranch, build a real house, maybe even start that horse breeding program we talked about?" "It feels wrong," Evelyn admitted. "Taking his money." "No," Jack's voice was firm. "It's not his money. It's yours. Payment for years of pain. And think of what we can do with it, not just for us, but for others." That sparked something in Evelyn's eyes. "A sanctuary," she said slowly. "For women like me, running for men like him. We have the space, and now the means." Jack smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. There's my girl, always thinking of others. Within 6 months, the Double C Ranch had grown to include a second house, sturdy and welcoming, with rooms for women seeking shelter. Word spread quietly, carefully, through churches and doctors, through whispered networks of those who understood. They came slowly at first, then steadily. Women with bruised faces and broken spirits, often with children in tow, seeking safety and a chance to start over. Evelyn taught them skills, sewing, cooking, reading, and writing for those who'd never learned. Jack taught them to ride, to shoot, to defend themselves. More importantly, they both taught by example that broken didn't mean worthless, that scars could heal, that life after violence was possible. One such woman was Sarah Morrison, who arrived with her young daughter on a rainy Tuesday, both of them thin as rails and jumping at shadows. She'd fled from a husband in Denver who'd treated her like property, and the fear in her eyes was all too familiar to Evelyn. "He'll find me," Sarah whispered that first night, clutching her daughter close. "He always said he would. Then we'll be ready," Evelyn said simply, remembering another woman who'd once believed escape was impossible. "You're not alone anymore." The test came 3 weeks later. Dale Morrison rode up to the ranch with 2 hired guns, whiskey brave and full of rage. "I've come for my wife," he shouted. "Sarah, get out here, woman." Jack stepped onto the porch, rifle casual in his hands but ready. "No one here by that name. Friend, you'd best move along." "I know she's here." Morrison's hand went to his gun. "This is the place that takes in wayward women, teaches them to disobey their husbands, teaches them they're human beings," Evelyn corrected, stepping out beside Jack. "With the right to live without fear." Morrison's face twisted with recognition. He'd heard the stories of the widow killer who'd started this place. "You," he spat. "Should have known. One murderess protecting another." "The only murderers I see," Jack said quietly, "are men who beat women and children. Now, I'll ask once more, leave. Don't come back." Morrison went for his gun. Jack was faster, his shot knocking the weapon from Morrison's hand. The hired guns. Seeing the dozen rifles that suddenly appeared from windows and behind water troughs, the women had learned to defend their sanctuary, decided their pay wasn't worth their lives. As Morrison retreated, cradling his bleeding hand and shouting threats, Sarah stood at an upstairs window with tears streaming down her face, but for the first time since she'd arrived, she stood straight, unbowed by fear. That night, they celebrated quietly. The women cooked a feast, the children played freely in the yard, and for a moment, the ranch felt like what Evelyn had always dreamed of. A home, not just for her and Jack, but for anyone who needed it. Later, as they sat on their porch watching the stars, Jack took Evelyn's hand. "No regrets?" he asked, their old ritual. "None," she said, then reconsidered. "One, maybe." His eyebrows rose in question. "Thomas," she said softly, "I wish he could see this, see what his sacrifice helped build." Jack squeezed her hand. "He sees, somewhere, somehow. That boy sees his sister strong and free and helping others find the same. He's proud. Evelyn, I guarantee it." A year turned to 2, then 5. The Double C Ranch grew into a small community. Some women stayed only until they could stand on their own feet. Others, like Sarah, made it their permanent home, helping to run the sanctuary and welcome new arrivals. The main house grew to include a schoolroom, a proper medical clinic, and workshops where women learned trades that could support them independently. Jack and Evelyn's own family grew too. First came Joseph, born on a spring morning with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determined chin. Then Anna, 2 years later, who had Evelyn's dark hair and Jack's quiet smile. Raising children in a sanctuary for broken souls might have seemed strange to some, but the children grew up understanding that strength came in many forms and that everyone deserved safety and respect. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they held a different kind of ceremony. Not a wedding, but a dedication. Judge Mackenzie, now retired but still a friend, came up from Cheyenne to officially recognize the Double C Sanctuary and territorial records. Marshall Crawford, who'd become an unexpected ally after witnessing their trials, brought his wife and a donation from a collection taken up among lawmen who'd seen too many women with no place to run. 5 years ago, Evelyn spoke to the gathered crowd, residents, supporters, and curious neighbors alike. I came to Wyoming territory running from a past I thought would destroy me. I found more than safety here. I found love, purpose, and the knowledge that our scars don't define us. What we do with our survival does. Today, Jack continued, his hand finding Evelyn's, we dedicate this place to all who need shelter from life's storms. May it stand as proof that love is stronger than fear, that hope can bloom in the hardest ground, and that sometimes the very experiences that nearly break us become the foundation for something beautiful. As applause rang out across the valley, a young woman appeared on the road, another soul seeking sanctuary, another life ready to be rebuilt. Evelyn smiled, remembering her own arrival in a strange town, frightened and alone. Now she stood ready to offer what she'd once desperately needed: safety, understanding, and the promise that this wasn't an ending but a beginning. That night, after the children were asleep and the ranch had settled into peaceful quiet, Jack and Evelyn walked to the small cemetery they'd created on a hillside overlooking the valley. Thomas's memorial stone stood there. They'd had one made even though his body rested in Mercy's Bend. Beside it were smaller markers for women who'd come to them too late, too broken by violence to heal. We did it, Evelyn whispered, laying wildflowers on her brother's marker. We built something good from all that pain. Jack wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her head. We did, and it's just the beginning. As they stood there, the wind carried the sound of laughter from the main house, women sharing stories, children playing, life going on despite all attempts to crush it. It was the sound of triumph, quiet but certain, like grass growing through cracks in stone. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their darkest moments and brightest joys. And in that moment, Evelyn Hart Carver knew with bone-deep certainty that every scar had been worth it. Every tear had watered the ground for this harvest of hope. She leaned back into Jack's embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back, the heart she'd helped heal, just as he'd healed hers. Together, they'd proven that love could indeed bloom in the hardest ground, that two broken people could build something whole and beautiful and lasting. The cowboy who'd refused to love again and the widow who'd bled her secrets into his rough hands had found their happy ending, not in the absence of scars, but in the courage to let those scars become a map to guide others home. And as they walked back to their house, their sanctuary, their life, the mountains stood witness to a love story written not in perfection but in perseverance, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that bloom in the aftermath of surviving everything that tried to destroy them. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the untamed frontier of the heart. If you're listening to this tale of love and redemption, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles, just like Jack and Evelyn connected across their pain. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories that prove love conquers all, even in the harshest landscapes. Share your thoughts on Jack and Evelyn's journey. Did their story touch your heart as much as it touched mine? Until we meet again around the campfire, partners, keep believing in second chances and the power of love to heal all wounds.